This happened when I was a teenager, many years ago. I was with my best friend Tony at my house. My parents were gone somewhere, but I don't remember where. Tony and I had been best friends for many years and felt like brothers. We enjoy pranking our friends and other similar activities. Tony had the idea to make a prank phone call to one of our friends while we were hanging out. This was prior to the widespread adoption of smartphones. Cell phones existed, but they lacked the capabilities that we have today. So we were going to call our friend Adam, and Tony had prepared a whole joke to tell him. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was probably extremely stupid. So we dialed Adam's number from one of my house phones. It rang a few times before someone we thought was Adam answered. Tony got into his joke and wouldn't stop. After he had spoken for about a minute, the person on the other end spoke. It was a man, just not Adam. It sounded like an adult, and I believe we were around 14. The guy was furious. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he was asking us who was calling, what was wrong with us, and so on. When we realized it wasn't Adam, we were both surprised and embarrassed. Tony just hung up the phone while the guy was still speaking. We had a good laugh about it, but we decided not to call Adam again. That was enough prank calls for us. Instead, we chose to play video games. However, just a few moments after hanging up, the phone began to ring. We didn't have caller ID, so I answered it without knowing who was calling, though I think we both suspected it was the guy we had just dialed by accident. He picked the phone and answered. I overheard the same guy speaking, and he still sounded angry. I hung up on him, and he called again shortly after that. This time, however, we did not answer the phone. We began playing video games at that point, and over the next 30 minutes or so, the guy called back several times, which we assumed was him, but we did not answer and simply let it ring. Finally, we stopped receiving calls. We probably played for another hour or so after the call. That's when there was a knock on the front door. I was perplexed when I heard it. Lived in a fairly typical neighborhood, but knocks on the door at night were extremely unusual. We were in my bedroom, and I walked out into the living room. I moved over to the front door and looked out the window. Didn't know the guy standing there. He looked directly at me as I looked at him. Stepped away from the door, and he knocked again. Went back to my room and informed Tony that a man was present. The phone rang again. We were both wondering if it could be the same person, so we answered the phone this time. The man spoke, and he instructed us to go outside. When I heard that, I immediately hung up the phone again. The man must have been calling from his cell phone. He knocked on the door again, and we both stepped out into the living room. We heard him yell for us to come out. The man appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and a jacket. That is all I remember about him. We didn't answer the door, however. He stayed for a few more minutes before leaving. After that, Tony and I just waited for the phone to ring again, or for the guy to return, which he never did. After that, we never made another prank phone call to anyone. I believe the guy we called must have had caller ID. He could have looked up our address in the phone book. Honestly don't know, but that is my best guess. It still creeps me out that he showed up at my home. I am female and lived alone in my apartment at the time. I was home alone one night when I received a phone call. I picked it up and answered, but there was no response at first. When I asked if anyone was there, there was silence for a few seconds. Then finally, a man spoke. I didn't recognize the voice as someone I knew. He said he had the wrong number and hung up. After that, I didn't think much about it. Occasionally, phone calls were made to the wrong numbers. It was certainly more common than it is today. So, after a few days, I received another late-night call. I picked up the phone and said hello, but there was no answer. I said hello several more times, but no one answered, and the person who called me hung up. The following night, it happened again. By this point, I was becoming increasingly suspicious. I had no idea what was going on, but it seemed strange that it kept happening. They would call, and I would answer, but they would say nothing. It always seemed to happen late at night. It was really creeping me out, and I was curious what was going on. However, I did not receive any more calls for the rest of the night. The next strange occurrence did not involve a phone call. I left for work the next morning, following the previous call. My commute to work usually took around 15 minutes. Now I was being followed the entire way there. I know this because the street where my apartment was located was very quiet. The next few streets I would drive down were usually quiet. So I noticed a car driving behind me, but I couldn't tell who was driving it. When I got to the highway, I forgot about it and assumed it wouldn't follow me anymore. There were many more vehicles on the highway. Thought it was a coincidence up until that point. When I took my work exit, I noticed a car behind me. I drove a few more streets, and the car did the same. This had never happened before, and I had a strong suspicion that they were intentionally following me. Now I was starting to worry. But literally right before my turn for work, the car went in a different direction. I wasn't sure what to think about it. After work that night, drove home and was not followed. I did not receive any phone calls that night, but I did the following night. This time, I believe it was around 11 o'clock. When the phone rang, I walked over to pick it up. After responding, I heard a man's voice. He said he was my neighbor down the hall and asked if I could come over right away. He said he needed some assistance. Something about it just felt fishy. I thought I recognized the voice, but not as a neighbor, and I was pretty sure whoever it was didn't know my phone number. I went to the door and peered through the peephole out of curiosity. When I did, I noticed a man standing right on the other side. I wasn't sure who he was, but I suspected he was behind the strange occurrences. Instead, I called 911 and reported a suspicious man at my apartment. I then received another call from the person claiming to be my neighbor. Responded by asking who the neighbor was. I remember him coming up with a name like Steve or something. He just kept telling me to get out of my apartment because it was urgent. I returned to the door and looked out. The guy was still there. I told him I had called the cops. When I said this, I saw him turn and walk away. After that, he disappeared. The police arrived a short time later, and I told them everything the man had done. Unfortunately, they couldn't do much about it. However, I did decide to change my phone number. Following that, I did not receive any more calls. I was also not followed, and no one visited my apartment. Although I only stayed in that apartment for about a month, I never found out who did it or why. For months, every time my phone rang late at night, I worried it was that man calling. Something bizarre happened to me a few years ago. I received a new cell phone and a new number. I had been in need of a new phone for quite some time, and my previous service had been Supper. However, after switching over, I began to receive strange phone calls and texts. The first call came from an unfamiliar number. Obviously, I didn't recognize any of the new numbers after picking up the phone, but when I answered, a man spoke and asked why I hadn't returned his calls. I realized he had the wrong number and informed him. However, for some strange reason, he did not believe me, so I hung up on him. A while later, I received a text message from a different number. This text said something like, "Hey, call me when you get the chance." Once again, I didn't recognize the number and responded by asking who it was. They responded with a name I didn't recognize, and I informed them that they had the wrong number. This individual did not respond. Over the next week, I received at least 10 different text messages and probably 10 phone calls. The majority of them came from different phone numbers, though some were the same. I responded to the majority of them with wrong number. I realized that the previous person who had my phone number most likely did not notify their contacts that they had changed numbers, and they must have had a large number of friends or something. Answered another random call out of curiosity. There was another man I didn't know, and I informed him that he had the wrong number and that I had recently received a new one. The man on the other end stated that he did not understand. I began to explain to him that I had received a new phone and service, but he abruptly hung up. I put up with random texts and phone calls for the next 2 days. Almost everything I started ignoring. Some people continued to text me after I told them they had the wrong number. It was a little annoying, and I considered asking to change the numbers. Then, I received a text from someone who had previously texted me several times. They told me I needed to cut the crap and that no one would believe my new number. Then they threatened to make my life miserable if I didn't start cooperating. As I read that, I wondered who on earth had this number before me. I did not respond and was unsure what to do, but I got another text saying they could find me and that I couldn't hide forever. By this point, the majority of the threatening messages were coming from 2 or 3 different numbers. After a few days of receiving such texts, I couldn't take it any longer. I went to the police and got a new phone number. I told the cops about my situation, and they told me to get a new number and that they would handle the investigation. So I got a new number, and I wasn't bothered anymore. However, I never learned anything else about those people, such as their identities. I'm still wondering why I was receiving those texts. To provide some context, this happened to me in the 1990s. During this time, I was a single female living alone in a home. I worked at a downtown office. My previous employer was a large corporation with offices located throughout the city and country. Once, there was a large work party held at a downtown hotel. It was a big deal, and hundreds of employees from various offices were invited. During my visit, the first few hours were enjoyable. I was mingling with coworkers and friends from work. However, as the night came to a close, I was about to leave when a man approached me. I was standing off to the side a little when he walked up and introduced himself. I had seen him earlier at the party, but I didn't recognize him, so he must have worked in another office. I don't remember his name, but he was obviously interested in me. But something about him didn't sit well with me. He seemed strange, and I wasn't interested in him. We talked for a short time, just basic conversation. He told me he worked somewhere else and asked how I liked my job. So at the end of the conversation, I mentioned that I was planning to leave. He asked if I wanted to share a cab, but I declined and said I would drive there. He then asked for my phone number before leaving. Looking back, this is ridiculous, but when some guys asked for my phone number and I wasn't interested, I would give them the wrong number. It was much easier back then because not everyone owned a cell phone. I did own a cell phone, but I rarely used it. Because my cell phone was large and bulky, I would mostly use it at home. So I gave him a random wrong number, shook his hand, and walked away. After that, I stayed at the party for about 5 more minutes. Said my goodbyes to a few coworkers before leaving. I left the hotel and went to my parked car on the street. I then drove home. I lived only about 10 minutes away, and my house was just outside of the city. The neighborhood was very busy, and the houses were extremely close together. I went inside, and about a minute later, there was a knock at my front door. It was almost 11:00 p.m., so I knew this was strange. I walked over to the door and answered it without first checking to see who was there. When I opened the door, I noticed the guy from the party. It was shocking to see him here. When I asked him what he was doing, he appeared angry He told me that he called my number and was connected to a random guy who had no idea who I was. Then he told me that he knew I had given him the wrong number and asked why. There was little I could say. I simply told him I was not interested, but that does not mean he could follow me home. He said a few more angry things to me before approaching my door and appearing to attempt to enter my home. I quickly slammed the door closed. He caught it just before it closed, however, and attempted to stop me. I had to practically throw my entire body against the door to get it to close. I was finally able to, so I locked it. He tried opening the door several times before pounding on it. I yelled at him that I was calling the cops. At first, he kept banging on the door. I didn't think anything would stop him, so I went over to the phone. He eventually came to a stop and walked away. Watched him leave that night, and I never saw him again. I was worried he'd show up at random or something, but he didn't. This was the last time I ever gave someone the wrong number.